Here we go.
Well, how many years has it been that we haven't had the base in it?
Over 2,000, I think.
No, that's how many years exactly?
I don't know.
That's surprising. We don't know if we're not.
I have to see what year.
We went there.
Like every year, Tishba, we should count how many years.
Yeah,
I hear. We put them. Okay, so Gemara, Boil the Noiva Givon. They came to Noiva Givon. And what's the halacha about Noiva Givon? Well, let's quickly take a peek because we have to what the Gemara is going to be explaining on Kuf Yud Beis Amud Beis is when the Gemara discusses Boil the Noiva Givon. Let's see what happened. When they came to Noiva Givon, Zok the Gemara, Zok the Mishnah, that is, Hutra Abamis, that's when there was a heter for Abamis, Kachikachim Nachalam Lefnim and Aklayim, and Kadashim Kalam B'chol Ori Yisrael, but there's no talk about Meiser Sheni. There's no talk about Meiser Sheni. If you look at the Shita, it brings in Meiser Sheni, but there's a Shaila if it actually addresses Meiser Sheni, and that'll become now clear because the Gemara is going to discuss Meiser Sheni. But our lotion is, again, and Kadashim Kalim B'chalor Yisrael, but it doesn't mention Meiser. So let's see what the Gemara says. How do we know this? The Tana Rabbanon, how do we know that there was a heter abamais in between Shiloi and the Beis Hamikdash? Because the pasuk says Kilavotam adata ela Menucha, which we know is referring to Shiloi, but Nachala ela Menucha is Shiloi, and Nachala zu Yerushalayim. Lama Chalkan up Kasuk. Lama Chalkan. Why did the Torah split up and say Menucha and Nachala? It's because it could have just said Kilavotam adata ela Menucha. You didn't get the Shiloi yet, and once we have Shiloi, there's no more Bamais. It doesn't say that. It says Shiloi and the Beis Hamikdash. To tell us that there's going to be a heter bamais in between Shiloi and the Beis Hamikdash. And the Bach says, if that's the case, Meiser Sheni, Nami listening, why doesn't it say Meiser Sheni? Rashi says, Hachi, the Shas Heter, Havari, it was a Shas Heter, Bamais, Naisi Nami Meiser Sheni, Lenoiva Givine. Why weren't they able to bring Meiser Sheni to Noiva Givine? Showing Nistalka Kol Kedusha Shiloi. Once there's no more Kedusha of Shiloi, Umatam Loit Nam B'Mestisan Loich Loisham. So, even if it says Meiser Sheni in the Mishnah, what does it say about Meiser Sheni in the Mishnah? That you can eat it b'chol gvul Yisrael. It doesn't say that it's limited to be eaten there. The question is why, the way Rashi would learn is why, even if it says Meiser Sheni, why isn't it supposed to be eaten near Noiva Givon? Or the Shaila could be, why doesn't it mention Meiser Sheni at all? So Gemara, Amar Lei, Meiser is an exception. Shom me'oren chayalfi. The only time Meiser Sheni is connected to the Mishkan is only if the Oren Kodesh is there. And we learned that from Shom. Let's have a look at the Psukim where it says that. It says, V'achaltem Shom lefnei Hashem alekechem u'tzamachtem b'chol mishlach yidechem atem u'vetechem asher berach Hashem alekecha v'achaltem lefnei Hashem alekecha b'mokem asher yivchar l'shaken shemay Shom. What should you eat here? Ma'asher degondcha tiroshcha v'yitzarecha u'v'koresh b'karcha v'tenecha. So it says Shom in reference to Meiser, and then it says in the Melachas Mishkan, V'samta Shom es aroin ha'edus. And we learn, like Rashi says, V'chaltem Shom inami l'fnei Hashem l'kecha b'mokem asher yivchar l'shaken shemay Shom u'baring ksiv Shom, and therefore if there's no oren, there's no din to either Meiser Sheni there, or maybe there's no din Meiser Sheni at all. So let's learn now there's no din Meiser Sheni because there was no oren. Okay, gewaltig. Zog to Gemara, even the Aron Lahava, Meiser Nami Lahavoi. Since there was no Aron, there was no Din Meiser at all. So it doesn't discuss Meiser by Noiva Givine because there was no Meiser. The parish of Meiser was not relevant by the 57 years of Noiva Givine. Correct the Gemara, if it's all based on the Sham, then there shouldn't have been a Korban Pesach either. Yochi Pesach Bekochim, none of the Korbanos or the Korban Pesach should be relevant. You know why? The Sham Me'aron Yalfi. The very same person. It says V'chal Lefnei Hashem Elokechem B'mokam Mashiach L'shachin Shemay Sham Ma'aseh Dogancha Tiroischa Yitorecha U'v'chosh B'chorcha B'tzenecha. It's referring to all the different Korbanos. So you should also learn it out of the Aron. And then you should say the same thing. Even the Aron lo have it, and the Nami lo have it. That's what you should say as well. Look what Rashi says. Pesach v'kochim nami do v'achaltem shom b'hu nami ksiv.
Can we back up for a minute? Sure. You're saying that there was no mitzvah of Meiser Sheni at all?
That's one mahalach of how they learn, that there was no din Meiser Sheni.
So that year that they were supposed to bring Meiser Sheni, do they bring Meiser Rishon? Because or 1 minute. Isn't there's a schedule of Meisers, right?
Right. The first 2 years it's Meiser Rishon and Meiser Oni, and the third year it could be Meiser Rishon and Meiser Sheni. But the Meiser Rishon and Meiser Oni aren't connected in any way to the Beis Hamikdash. It's Meiser Sheni that has to be eaten.
That's right.
Meiser Oni can be eaten anywhere.
So what happens that year? Is there any Meiser?
There would be Meiser Rishon, but there wouldn't be Meiser Sheni.
Okay.
So there's actually a discussion if that's what the Gemara means, that there's no din Meiser Sheni at all, or there's no din to eat Meiser Sheni near Yerushalayim.
Well, Yerushalayim at that time belonged to Yavuz.
It would be Noiva Givon. The question would you have to eat it around the Noiva Givon. So if we speak in the Toyshus over here, Pirish Bekundus Dola Il Bebola Gilgo Lehuska Meiser Sheni. Rashi mentions it doesn't discuss Meiser Sheni by Gilgal either. We have to see Rashi inside. Heter Brahma Ben Zelazeh. The Krab Heter Brahmois the Gilgal Mushtoi. The Torah is talking about the Heter Brahmois that existed when we were in Gilgal. The Kamar Admosai Ani Oimer Lachem Ish Kol Yosher Be'enov Ki Levosam Adata. That's only during the period of Gilgal, but once you come to Menucha, which is Shilai, there's no more allowance for a Brahma. The Ein Heter Bejulazul Havala Lemichtav Ala Menucha. It only would have to say Menucha, because once Shilai would have started, no more Bamas. With the Nachala, when it says Nachala, meaning the Beis Hamikdash, Mami Nadachi Kamalahu. Acher Yedushes Menucha, Tachzur Leheter Rishon. You'll be able to go back to your Bamas. Ad Bayacham Ala Nachala. Zok Tgemar Ihaki the Shas Heter Hava Naisi Nami Meiser Sheni L'Noi V'Givon. So Rashi learns you'd have to bring your Meiser Sheni to Noi V'Givon. Why? Since there's no Kedusha Shila anymore, you should have to eat the Masheni around Noi V'Givon. Why didn't the Mishnah tell you to eat it there? So Tosfos says, there's no Masheni by Gilgal Vishaloi Nohagu Maisers Ad La'achar Yerusha V'Yeshiva. During the first 14 years, there was no Din Maisers at all. The Talmud, the Parchacha B'Gemara, the Meiser Sheni Nami Naske Lahasam V'Noi V'Givon. We're saying that we wanted to suggest over here that the Meiser Sheni you'd have to bring to Noi V'Givon. Umasik in the Gemara here, the Maskana says the Mastizir of Shimini Domer Chayva Shein Kavu Lamzman Loi Karvu Danu BeBechar Umaiser Behema by Bechar and Meiser Behema. Is what the chayvus that were not the korbanos that were not chayvel as man. The chivin the ma'aser beima lo have a hosam ma'aser dogan nami lo be you saw hosam. You don't need to bring ma'aser dogan either. We'll learn that in just a minute. This is not done. Zog Toitzvis, v'hashtem high time of the Ishkes Lemaiser, lo yehi nechal klal, k'moy Meiser be'ema b'noi v'givon. So Toitzvis wants to suggest that maybe you should have to separate Meiser Sheni, but you won't be able to eat it at all. L'mal damar lekar b'chayvos. But you trichen lahamtin v'b'chor Meiser, they have to wait with their b'chor Meiser, achi yumamu, until they would get a mum. V'nechal b'mum l'maylam. But Meiser Sheni would have no eitzo, Meiser Sheni, lo yehelet akana el pigeon. You wouldn't be able to do anything with the Meiser Sheni other than pigeon, you wouldn't be able to eat it. But v'yeshvarm the lagarsi b'masnis the Meiser Sheni klal, gabi noi v'givon. Our Gersh in our Mishnah does not say anything about Meiser Sheni. V'nir lefarish the le'in haba hu shayich lahachish. The whole hekesh is only legabi bringing it. The ihai ton habos mokim gam ze yiton habos mokim. If Meiser Behema would need to be brought to the Beis Hamikdash, Meiser Sheni would have to be brought to the Beis Hamikdash. Kedam lo Yehuda. However, the Amar Koivois Karvu, the Benoi v'Givon Nechal Gam Meiser Sheni Nechal Sham, Ava Masha Ein Meiser Behema Karv le Reb Shimon. But according to Reb Shimon, you wouldn't be Makrav Meiser Behema because it's not a chov that's designated. Therefore, you wouldn't extend that to Meiser Sheni, that shouldn't be able to be eaten. And that doesn't make sense by Meiser Sheni. So there's a whole discussion here. Are we discussing Meiser Sheni shouldn't be eaten? Should only be eaten near the Beis Hamikdash, or maybe regardless, you should be able to eat the Meiser Sheni. Just a question if you have to bring it there. Zok to Gemara, but based on your explanation of Sham, then you shouldn't bring any Pesach or Chayves or Gavulam Zam. No korban should be brought. Zok to Gemara, Amalei Hamani Reb Shimoni. We're aborting the Sham. The reason why you don't bring Meiser Sheni to Noi V'Givon is not because of Sham, and that answers our kasha why all karbonis you'd bring. But the reason we're going to Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon says the av tzibur lo yikrivu el pesach v'choyves hakavu lanzman. Reb Shimon held that even a korban tzibur, the only type of karbonos that were brought were either something that's baba nedava, that's choyves hakavu lanzman, or the korban pesach, which is a chayv. Aval choyves shein kvu lanzman, but Meiser Behema, for instance, hacha v'hacha lo karev. You wouldn't be makrib at all, not in a Baba Gdola, not in a Baba Ktana. So Meiser Behema is a perfect example of Chayva Shein Kvulam Zman. So right off the bat, according to Reb Shimon, Meiser Behema, you would not be makrib at all. Now, once we know that Meiser Behema is not makrib, there's a hekish from Meiser Dogan to Meiser Behema. The iskish Meiser Dogan to Meiser Behema. Meiser Dogan is compared to Meiser Behema, because it says, so there we learn that all the Meishers are compared to each other, and therefore, since we know we couldn't bring Meiser Behema, not in Noi V'Givon, not on the Bama, according to Reb Shimon, who adin, you wouldn't be able to bring Meiser Shema. Zok Rashi, Reb Shimoni, the Amar Chayvoi Shein Kavulam Zman, Loi Karvu B'Noi V'Givon, that would include the Ani B'Chayoi Su Meiser Behema. The year of time Kedam and Lo B'Gilgal, we learned it before. Remember we said that the Korban Pesach was brought in Gilgal the first year. Why did the Torah have to say you bring the Korban Pesach? All Korban should be brought. Elamai, the Torah teaching us Davka the Korban Pesach because it's a Korban that's scheduled. It's Korban Rabbim of Chiyuv that's scheduled. But Meiser Behema doesn't always happen at the same time. The Chiyuv and the Meiser Behema have a Hasam. Since Meiser Behema, they weren't going to be makriv by Noi V'Givon, Meiser Dogan Nami Loi Boila. So you don't have to bring Meiser Dogan there either. To Iskish Ladodi. The Chsiv Aser to Aser, Barminon B'Shtei Meiser Shekosef Medaber. So Aser to Aser compares Meiser Behema to Meiser Dogan. And therefore, just like Meiser Behema, you wouldn't have been makriv by Noi V'Givon, according to Reb Shimon, which is wrong according to Reb Shimon now, so too Meiser Dogan you don't bring by Noi V'Givon. And the Mandamer who is makish them together is actually Reb Shimon. Okay, Gabaltik. Michlad Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda argued on Reb Shimon and he held all karbonis you could bring any carbon tzibur, right? Whatever what did you say? Whatever carbon you would have brought in the Mishkan, in the Midbar, you would be able to bring here as well. So Machlal Rabbi Yehuda Karv, you would be Makabit, and you have to bring Ma'aser Sheni as well. Zok to Gemara, and you're 100% right. The Amar Abada Bar Masna, Ma'aser Sheni, U'Ma'aser Behema, Nechalun B'nei V'Givan the Rabbi Yehuda, because he held any carbon that you would have brought in the Mishkan, in the Midbar, you would bring here as well. I fake the Gemara about Boy Bira. In order to eat Meiser, you need Lefnei Hashem Alekechem. There has to be a Beis Hamikdash standing. Velav, and we don't have one. So Gemara, Tani Rabbi Yosef, Sholosh Biras, or maybe Velav Tani Rabbi Yosef. Didn't Rabbi Yosef say that Sholosh Biras saying there were 3 biras? Shilei v'noi v'givin nevei salamim. He considers, Rabbi Yosef considers noi v'givin as a bira. Okay, who tani levu amala lachilas mashasheni v'alibud Rabbi Yehuda. And this would be going according to Rabbi Yehuda. These are considered biras. Rabbi Yosef said that these buildings were considered biras. They were considered just like the Beis Hamikdash, lagabe achilas mashasheni, and that would be consistent with Rabbi Yehuda, who he said holds that you could bring Ma'aser Behema and Ma'aser Sheni to the Bama. Okay, Bo Yerushalayim. When it came to Yerushalayim, then the 3 zones were Yerushalayim, which was Machne Yisrael, then there was the Harbais, which was Machne Levia, and then there was the Azor, which was Machne Shechina. Tanar Banim. Ki levosam adata ela Menucha v'ela Nachala. And we explained that the Menucha is Shilai, Nachla is Yerushalayim. We have psukim to prove it. Hashem said, this is where HaKadosh Baruch Hu was not happy with Klal Yisrael. I believe this is in Yirmiyah. My dear nation of Klal Yisrael is like Ka'aryeh Bayar, like a lion in the forest, Nosna Alai B'kola Al Kein Tisiyah. It attacks everybody around it. I don't like that. There's internal fights in Klal Yisrael. That's why I don't like it anymore. V'omer ha'ayit tzavua, which is some type of a wild bird. Ha'ayit tzavua nachalosi, my nachala. Li ha'ayit tzavavala l'chu isu kol chayis esada ha'chilachla. They're going to be destroyed. It's when Hashem was announcing that Klal Yisrael was going to be destroyed. There'll be a golus. So Gemara, Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda, and this is where we know that Nachla is referring to Yerushalayim. Rabbi Shimon Omer, he argues and says Menucha is Yerushalayim. Exactly the opposite. Ki lavasi ala Menucha. Menucha is referring to Yerushalayim, and Nachla is referring to Shilai, and he has rayas. But Omer Zois Menuchasi, referring to Yerushalayim. Zois Menuchasi adei ad poi eshev kivisia. V'yomer, another pasuk says Kivacher Hashem b'tzion iva l'moishavlai. So here it calls the Menucha the Ivisia, my dwelling, and how do we know that's referring to Yerushalayim? Because the next pasuk says Kivacher Hashem b'tzion iva l'moishavlai. So Tzion is that pasuk. Tzion is that pasuk. Actually, the pasuk before is pasuk Yud Gimel. Kivach Hashem b'tzion iva l'moishavlai, and this next pasuk is Zois Menuchasi. So Zois Menuchasi is referring to Tzion. If Menucha is Shilai, it makes sense. That's what the pasuk says. Ki levasam ata ela Menucha v'ela Nachla. You didn't come to Shilai, and you didn't come to Yerushalayim. And Shilai would have been mentioned first because Shilai happened first. And Menucha is Yerushalayim. If Menucha is Yerushalayim and Nachla is Shilai, so what it should say was ela Nachla v'ela Menucha b'Beilei. Because first you got to Shilai, and only then did you get to Yerushalayim. Zok Amar Amar, Lo mi by Menucha. Lo matisu, what the pasuk is saying, never mind you didn't reach Yerushalayim. You didn't even get to Shilai yet, and that's why there's going to be a heter bonus. Tana Devei Rabbi Shmuel, Zu v'zu Shilai. He holds that Tzai Menucha and Tzai Nachla are referring to Shiloi. Now the problem is if they're both referring to Shiloi, and the Torah is saying that you can have Bamais until Shiloi, so wouldn't that indicate that after Shiloi you can't have Bamais anymore? And we know after Shiloi, during the period of Novi Givon, Bamais were allowed. So Zot Rashi, Zuvazi Shiloi, Vafilu Achiyesh Heter Basra. There's still a Heter Bamais afterwards, after Shiloi. But not because of any pasuk that we have here. There's a general rule that tells us that after Shiloh was destroyed, you would once again be able to be makav abramis. Why? The kasavar kedusha rishayna kitcha l'shaita v'la kitcha l'asad. Because this Rabbi Shmuel holds that whenever there's a kedusha, it wasn't permanent, and it's not only by Shiloh does he say this. He says it by all kedushas. Even if the kedusha is Yerushalayim gufa severe loy diyesh acharei heter. Rabbi Shmuel holds that whenever there's a kedusha, it's only there while it's there. After Churban Bayis, there is no more din kedusha on Har Bayis. Kedemir Megillah Shemati Shemakrivim beveis chayna b'zman hazeh. Nowadays, that there's no more Beis Hamikdash, the kedusha Rishon is bottled, and now you could even be makav karbanos in Beis Chayna. Ukimna Rabbi Shmuel, we say that's going like Rabbi Shmuel. So Zuvaz and Shiloi, both Menucha and Nachala referring to Shiloi. Why is it that after Shiloi there was a Heter Bamais? Because Kedusha Rishayna, Kitchel L'Shaita V'Lo Kitchel L'Shalavai. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Zu V'Zu Yerushalayim, they're both referring to Yerushalayim. I believe this is the same Rabbi Shimon as we had earlier, and there's a machlokes and brises what Rabbi Shimon held. Zu V'Zu Yerushalayim. They're both referring to Yerushalayim. Zok Rashi, nivna habayis le'nashra b'amais. If they're both referring to Yerushalayim, that means there was a heter b'amais from when they got into Yisrael through the Shiloi period, through the Novi Givon period, until the Beis Hamikdash. So this shita holds that the heter b'amais lasted through the Mishkan Shiloi period as well. So Zok Gemara, b'shtam l'mandamar menucha zu Shiloi. If you hold menucha is Shiloi, which is like Titan Rabbi Shmuel and the Frierdiker Tanoim, then it'll make sense. Why? Menucha Shiloi and Nachla Yerushalayim. Inami Ibchor for Keret. So we have one referring to Yerushalayim and one referring to Shiloi. That's why there's two different words. And it's not just two words, the El HaMenucha, the El HaNachla, clearly it's talking about arriving at two places. El HaMenucha, the El HaNachla. Elamada Mezuvazu Shilai, or Zuvazu Yerushalayim, but according to both these shitas, Sai Tanu Rabbi Shmuel and Sai Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, who learned that both are referring to the same place, what it should have said was Menucha v'Nachla miBoilei. It should say Kilei Vazam Alata, Ela Menucha v'Nachla, because it's the same place. El Menucha, El Menucha is mashma two different places. Zok Makasha, that's a kasha I'll have to live with. If you hold they're both Shiloi, which is talking to Rabbi Shmuel, Menucha makes sense that it's Shiloi, right? The Nachu Mikibush, it's called Menucha because they had some difficult years conquering Eretz Yisrael. Now they could rest. Like it says, even after the Milchama in Shushan, V'Nachu, Klal Yisrael rested on the 13th day or on the 14th day, either on the 14th day or on the 15th day by Purim. After a battle, the word Menucha is appropriate. Nachla, why would Shiloh be referred to as Nachla? The Palgo Hasam Nachlas, because it was by Shiloh where they finished splitting up the land. The land was split up in Shiloh. So the word Menucha is appropriate to address Shiloh with, and the word Nachla is appropriate to address Shiloh with. According to Shimon Yochai, who also both Yerushalayim, Bishlam and Nachla, I understand why Yerushalayim would be referred to as Nachla. Nachla Salamim, it's our permanent inheritance that we have. Menucha, why would Yerushalayim be referred to as Menucha? Why would the Beis Hamikdash be referred to as Menucha? My Menucha. So Menucha Sarin. It means the final resting place of the Aron. which I'm not sure if there is such a pasuk, but Rashi comments on where this pasuk is. I was unable to find the pasuk that says if I can't find the ksuvim, maybe yeshli mikra acher b'devayom neviim b'shleim. It says kuma Hashem Elokim lenuchecha ata v'reinuzecha. And there are those who ask, like Tosfos asks, once you're going to go to Kuma Hashem L'Nuchecha Ata V'Nezecha, so Tosfos Avamot Lavi Pasuk to be Yeshua, V'Haya Kinoyach Kaposh Ragalei Kahana Noisei Arin, or in Torah it says V'Yibin Torah Moshe V'Nuchu Yomer Shuva Hashem. So why didn't Rashi pick a Lashon Menucha that applies to the Aron even in Bamidra, even in Chamisha Chumsha Torah? But Akalpanim, the word Menucha is appropriate to refer to the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim. But during the period of Mishkan Shiloi, Bamos were allowed. That explains why Manoach, who was during the period of Mishkan Shiloi, he brought a carbon on a Bama. But if you hold that they both Shiloi, meaning Ubamos have Asiron, and during the period of Mishkan Shiloi, Bamos were forbidden. How could Manoach be makar a carbon on the Bama? Ma v'yikach Manoach. And for the Gemara, Hayra Shah Saisa. It was Hayra Shah. We had a very similar comment not too long ago when the Gemara had a discussion if a Bama also had to be built like a Mizbeach or if it could be a plain rock. The Gemara said, according to the Mandamar, who held it has to be built like a Mizbeach, like we find Noach built a Mizbeach, how was Manoach able to just bring it on a rock? And the Gemara answered there as well. It was a special situation over there that he was allowed. Tana Devar B'Shmuel, Reb Shimon ben Yochai. Tana Devar B'Shmuel ended up learning like Reb Shimon ben Yochai that Zev is Yerushalayim, Dam Rezuv is Yerushalayim. The Samanech Mashri Gavar LeGavri. This single shita, Reb Shimon ben Yochai, was able to draw the Beis Medrash of Devar B'Shmuel to his opinion, and everybody agreed at the end that Zuv Yerushalayim, meaning everybody agreed at the end that Bamos were mutter up until they built the Beis Hamikdash. Gavalti. Kara Kodshim. So what does it say over here? Let's have a look. Kara Kodshim. Go back to the Mishnah. We'll have cookie days on the base. Kara Kodshim. Shekdishon b'shas Isra Bamos. If you were makdish them b'shas Isra Bamos, ve'krivim b'shas Isra Bamos, mibachutz. That's how you b'asei v'loisa and the chayovin olav kares. But if it was a kedushin b'shas Heter Bamos, and there was a krivim b'shas Isra Bamos b'chutz, then we said a re'elu b'asei v'loisa, but the ain't chayovin olav kares. Then there wouldn't be kares. And one of those kedushin b'shas Isra Bamos. Then I read about say the aim by loises at all. So those are the three categories. The Zok Tahel the Gemara. Amar Kana Loishanu Elabishchita. That we say that if you were makdish them b'shas heter abamos, and then you shechted them b'chut b'shas isra abamos, you're not going to be chayiv koresh. You'll only be over an asena loiseseh. That's only if you shechted it b'chutz. Avol b'halo koresh not mechayiv. But if you were makdir it on the mizbeach, then you'll be chayiv koresh. So the carve out that we're saying does not get koresh is only referring to shchita. It's not referring to halo. My timer. Where would I kind of get that from? It says v'aleim toima. And we have to look at this inside. Ala samuchin timer. So let's have a look. Let's have a look. This is in Shlach, I believe. If you look at it inside, everything makes much more sense. Let's see where it is. But then I forget where it was. Lamb Tamar is Dalid. It's Vayikra Yuzai. I'm sorry. Achrimos. That's where it is. It's Achrimos. Okay, here we go. The parsha was split up into three parts of Shchut Echutz. The first one was Daber al Haran v'Bonav el Kol B'nei Yisrael Amart Leim Zeh Daber Ashir Shem Lemar Yishish B'Yisrael Sheyishrat Shor Ketzav. So we know that's referring to Shchita Echutz. Sheyishrat B'Chut Amachna LaPesach Lemar LaEviyai. So we said Dam Yechashev v'Nichres Ha'ish Ahu Mikerav Amay. Why Leman Hashivu B'nei Yisrael Sefchem Hashem Zercham V'Nasada V'Eviyam LaShem El Pesach El Moyed. This pasuk we said was referring to if you were makdish the behema during a shas heter b'mais and you shechted it b'shas iser b'mais. That's what this pasuk was referring to. The carbon that you were makdish when you were still allowed to have b'mais, now that there's a Isser B'mais, V'aviyum L'Hashem Al Pesach Al Moed, V'zachu Zivchashtom L'Shtom L'Koyin, V'lo Yizbuch Oida Zivchem L'Asir Mashem Zed Machareim. So there's the lav, and there's the say, and then it said Chuk Asolim Tia Zois Lohem, Zois V'Yacheres. Davka Da say and the Lois says, but there's no Chi of Chorus if you shechted a carbon b'chutz if you were makdish the carbon when it was still the Shas Heter B'mais. Right? That's what the Gemara said. Then the Gemara said, V'aleim Taimar is now talking about Halal B'chutz. It's a separate parsha. V'aleim Taimar, we were just talking about Halal B'chutz, there is an Isser Koros. So if you look at it carefully, there's the Isser Koros of Shchut Echutz, when you were makdish it, B'shas Isser B'mais, and you shechted it B'shas Isser B'mais. Then we have, as a subsidiary of Shchut Echutz, but what if when you were makdish it to the shas heter b'mais, there'll be no chi of kares, only a lavin in the say, and then V'aleim Taimar, whatever we're discussing up until now, meaning even if you were makdish it when there was a heter b'mais, if you were malit b'chutz, there will be the same chi of kares for all halal b'chutz, because it says V'aleim Taimar, V'aleim with an ayin. On the aleim literally means the way it says it here. It means to Klal Yisrael, you should say. But the Gemara wants to say says v'aleim tomer as if there was an ayin here. V'aleim on the above, on what we just discussed before, that when you shechted it b'chutz, since you were makdish it b'shas heter abamos, there won't be a chiv chorus. On that, if there's halal, there will be a chiv chorus. That is what the Gemara says. The Gemara is not same kasha we had last time. Correct the Gemara. V'aleim Tomer ala smuchen on what we just said. Ala smuchen on what we just said before. Okay. The Dalit says to make read water ala Rishayim Tomer. It's going on the above, meaning a case where you were makdish it b'shas heter b'mais. Maskaf l'Rabba. How could you say that? Mikziv v'aleim. It doesn't say v'aleim with the ayin, which would mean we're going back on the same case as before. It says aleim ksiv, meaning tel Klal Yisrael. So therefore, your whole touch up of the pasuk doesn't make sense. Void, your halach is wrong. Because Tanya we learned arba kalolos higher Rab Shimon Omer bekachim. Rab Shimon had 4 rules when it came to kachim and shchut echutz. A hekdishan b'shas isra b'mais. V'shachat v'hela b'shas isra b'mais v'chutz. That's the textbook case of shchut echutz. Harein ba'asei v'loiseza and v'yesh b'hem kares. Hekdishan b'shas heter b'mais, which is our case. V'shachat v'hela b'shas isra b'mais. Harein ba'asei v'loiseza and b'hem kares. So the Brisa says beferish. Rabbi Shimon said that even if you're a milet b'chutz, there's no din kares. So your halacha of Kana is wrong because it contradicts the Tana of Rabbi Shimon. Okay, what about Hekdishim b'shas Israel b'mais? V'shachad v'ela b'chutz b'shas heter abomis, hareim ba'aseh, like our Mishnah said, but there's no loishes, because there can't be a loishes to bring it out of the Mishkan if there is no Mishkan. Hekdeshem b'shas heter abomis, v'shachad v'ela b'shas heter abomis, poter miklum. The Achronim ask, what do you mean poter miklum? It's a cut for a carbon. Potter's mash, you did something wrong, but you're potter. It's a cut for a carbon. So we learned that there's two dinim in shchutei chutz. There's the first din that it's not oila, it doesn't work, but then there's also the isur shaboy, so there's no isur shaboy. But I'll call upon them, we have a four shabraysa from a Shimon that says that even if you're mailet b'chutz, if you were makdish to carbon b'shes seter abamis, there will be no chi of kares. So tiyufta or avkana tiyufta. Avkana who said that it'd be kares for Allah is always low. Okay, weiter. Ve'la kachim. So the Mishnah reckons a whole bunch of avodas that are not going to be mechayiv you kares if you do them b'chutz. It's only shchita and halah, but smicha wouldn't be mechayiv you b'chutz. Why? I'm sorry. These are the Mishnah says there's a whole bunch of things that you do in the real Mishkan, but you don't do by Abama. One of the avodas you don't do by Abama is smicha. Why don't you do smicha by Abama? Tichsiv lefnei Hashem. When the pasuk talks about smicha, it mentions lefnei Hashem, meaning not in your backyard, davka in the Beis Hamikdash or in the Mishkan, which was the Makom Kodesh. It says lahanaf oizet nufa lefnei Hashem. So whenever it says lefnei Hashem, it means not on a bama, not in your backyard. It means only by a proper mishkan. Okay, weiter. V'samach. V'samach. So lefnei Hashem v'samach. The din smicha is dafka lefnei Hashem. Okay. Shchitas tzafay. There's no chiv to shech with tzafay. Again, lefnei Hashem, when it talks about the shchita on the tzafan side, it also says lefnei Hashem, and therefore, once again, it won't apply to Abama, matanos, saviv. Remember, we said that by a chatash you have to have 4 matanos or shnaim shein arba. By Abama, you only need 1 matana. Tichsiv v'zork al mizbeach saviv. And in that pasuk, it also says lefnei Hashem. Let's see if we can see the pasuk. V'zog is al mizbeach saviv asher pesach oil moed. Again, davke something that's pesach oil moed. Tenufa you don't do by Abama. Tichsiv v'heinef akoy lefnei Hashem. Again, it says lefnei Hashem. V'agrefa you don't bring it to the mizbeach. We're talking about a mincha. Tichsiv v'gisha el hamizbeach. But that's not the whole story, because we have to say lefnei Hashem. So it says, "Ve'veitzes hamincha asher yasa me'ela Hashem ve'kriva lakoin ve'gisha al mizbeach." And right after that, it says, "V'tzeis hamincha haker v'oisha b'nayin lefnei Hashem el pnei mizbeach." So all of these avodas, it mentions lefnei Hashem, which would exclude doing this on the ball. Gewaltig. Zog to Gemara weiter. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ein mincha b'bama. You did not bring a mincha on a bama. Amar Jesus, l'divrei Omer yesh mincha b'bama. If you hold, you could bring a carbon mincha. You could bring a carbon mincha on the bama. Yesh oifos b'bama. You could be makar birds on the bama as well. L'divrei Omer ein mincha b'bama, ein oifos b'bama. Why? Because where do we know to exclude mincha b'bama? It says Zevachim. Zevachim. If you say Zevachim is davka, a carbon, it would exclude menachos. So if you can say Zevachim is dafke, it's not only memayit. Mincha, it's memayit oifis. If you hold this la dafke, it'll include both mincha and oifis. The coin, you don't need to have a coin doing the avodah on the bama. The chsiv v'zorak ha-koyin. Where did it say v'zorak ha-koyin? Dafke, we're talking about lefnei Hashem. V'zorak ha-koyin is dam. Again, al mizbach Hashem pesach oil moed. That's the only time kahuna is required. Big Shorish you don't need, L'shorish B'Kodesh, L'shorish you don't need, because it says Asher Yishoshu B'hem B'Kodesh. So these are only required in the Beis Hamikdash or in the Mishkan where it's a Makom Kodesh, not in your backyard. Rech Nichoich, which means you have to put it on the Mizbeach when it's not dried out, so there's still a Geshmak aroma. Again, Lashem. Mechitza b'damim. Remember, we said that there's a line that separates the top of the mizbeach from the bottom of the mizbeach to know which dam to spritz where. You don't have it by Bama. The Chsev Hoysa Pareshes at Chatzim Mizbeach, Tafka the Mizbeach in the Mishkan. Richot Yadayim, you don't need a Bama. The Chsev Ubekarva from El Mizbeach, Yechatzu when you get to the Mizbeach. Amar Rabbi Barchama, Lo Shonu Ela Bekache Bama Ktana. Now this, the Gersh is completely messed up here. I can't even read it in the Gemara. I have to read it out of the Mesivta, because the Gersh is completely wrong. So I'm going to read it inside the Mesivta. Amar Rabbi Barchama, Lo Shonu, the din that by the Bamas Tzibur you have to be mechalik between the Damim El Yoinim and the Damim El Tachtoinim. Certain kabbalah you split the dam above the chut sikra. Certain kabbalah you split the below the chut sikra. The ela bekache bama gedola, the krivu bama gedola. The avke kachim that were originally designated to be hukrab on the bama gedola, and you were makriv on the bama gedola. Aval bekache bama ktana, the karvinu bama gedola. But what if you had your private carbon oila, your private carbon inova, that you could have been makriv on the bama ktana, and you decided to be makriv on the bama gedola, and chitzri, for that you wouldn't either need to be makriv where you spritz the blood. So the oila you could spritz above, you'd be able to spritz the oila, the number oila, on top half of the mizbeach, because it's a carbon that was designated for a bama ktana. So that is what the Rabbi Barchama said. Talk to Gemara. The Gemara asked the question from him again from a totally different girsa. Rabbi asked the kasha. It says in the pasuk, it says in the brisa, shechazav v'shoik, the chazav v'shoik that's normally given to the kohen from a shlamim, utrumas lachmei toida, which are the breads that are given to the kohen from the lachmei toida. Nehagen, you only do that b'bama gedola, but the einay hagen b'bama ktana. They don't apply to bama ktana. But it's mashma. We don't care what the carbon came from. We don't care about the source of the carbon. It all depends on where it's brought. If it's brought in the bama gedola, it follows the rules of the bama gedola. So how could you, Rabbi say that if I brought a carbon like an oilus nedova that could have been brought on the bama ktana, even though I brought it on the bama gedola, I don't have to follow the rules of the bama gedola. This bride seems to indicate that whatever you bring on the bama gedola, when in Rome, there's the Romans. You'd have to do it with the rules of the bama gedola. So Gemara, Ema noihagin b'karchei bama gedola. Say the bride that it says that chazav v'shoik trumas lachmatoida, don't because it's noig b'bama. Say it's noig b'karchei bama gedola. Carbonas that were designated to the bama gedola, the noihagin b'karchei bama ktana, but would not be required if it was designated for bama ktana, and then you happen to have brought it to the bama gedola. Ikodamri, Amar Rabbi Barchama. There's another nusach as to what Rabbi Barchama said. Amar Rabbi Barchama lo shanu ela bizman bama gedola. The only time we say that you have to separate where the dam is, that's only during the period of times when there was a bama gedola, which means when you weren't even allowed to have a bama ktana. The krivim bama gedola. It was during the Mishkan Shilai. It was during the Mishkan in the Midbar, where you weren't allowed to have a bama ktana. That's when we say it's very important to spritz the blood of a carbon in the right place. But during the period of time where bama ktanas were allowed, there's no akpada on where you spritz the blood, even on the bama gedola. Again, we're changing the girsa because Argamar says Leva Messiah, and we have a whole different girsa. Most of Rabbah, and Rabbah asked a kasha on that halacha of Rabbi Barchama, because the brisa says again the same brisa says where chazav v'shoik utrumas lachmei toida hagin b'bama gedola ve'in hagin b'bama ktana. So you see, it's noig b'bama gedola even in Azman where the bama ktana was allowed. So we're asked to answer, Ema, bizman bama gedola, bizman bama ktana. Now in the article, does it also have the girsa that I'm reading? And like, there's no shita mekabetzes. I don't see anybody who's gers this. I don't know where the Mesivta got this girsa from, but this is the girsa. Like, am I reading words that definitely not in your text of your Gemara? But if you look at the English side, does it have it? Because like, it's very interesting that we're reading a totally different Gemara. Well, Peliga de Rabbi Lozer, Rami Bar Chama would argue on Rabbi Lozer. Why? Because the Amar Rabbi Lozer, Oilas Bamas Yachid, the Oila of a Bamas Yachid, Shechnisa Bifnim, that you decided to be makrivit in the Bama Gedola, Kaltua Mechitos L'Chaldovar, it becomes just like a carbon of a Bama Gedola, and therefore the dam where you spritz it would be very important. So you see, Rabbi Lozer holds that even b'shas heter habamais on the Bama Gedola, you still have to follow all the rules. Okay, so we'll stop here just to give us reference where we're up to in the Gemara itself is Boyer Abzera. We're all the way at the bottom, but again, I couldn't even read the text inside because it doesn't even resemble the girsa that the Mesivta brings down.
Yeah.
What do you have for the first Rami Bar Chama? What does it say by you by the first Rami Bar Chama? Like 2 lines up in the skinny lines.
Yeah.
What is in the article? Amar Rami Bar Chama,
Yeah.
Lo Shanu. No, before that, way before that. If you go back to 2 lines above where it gets wide.
Did they not teach the ruling of a major Bama requires to do roughly, except in regard to a sacrifice of a major?
Could you read the Lashon Gemara? Even in the English, it quotes the Gemara and then it translates it.
Yeah.
I want you just to read how it quotes the Gemara.
Yeah. Amar Rabba Bar Chama.
No, Amar Rami Bar Chama, yes.
Wow.
Yaloishanu, Ella, right? Right. So the words that you just read do not match the words that's in the text of the Gemara.
Yeah.
So
how do we?
So I don't know. Does he have a note where this girsa comes from? Because the Mesivta is gorish the same thing as the Art Scroll, but the Art Scroll in the English, the Hebrew words do not resemble the words of the Gemara. So does the Art Scroll say where he gets it from? It's just very puzzling. It's very strange.
How did we get the?
Where do they get the gears from? Usually they say where they got it from, but I don't know where they got it from.
It doesn't refer to the gears.
But you do see that the words in the English are completely different from our text. So how did the Art Scroll change it? Okay, so we'll stop here with Ma'am Shech tomorrow. I don't